Selamat datang di Chief Corner, masih di edisi khusus G20. Kali ini kita kedatangan tamu Mr. Tim Steele. Beliau adalah Senior Advisor di UNODC, United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. Hi, Tim.
Good day, Vita.
Now we are in Bali, and the time at 3 p.m.
So good afternoon. It's good. It's a very foggy morning in Vienna, Austria.
Okay, Tim. And the first question, maybe you can share us about the short elaboration about the UNODC Focus program. Especially, maybe you can share us to follow the G20 summit.
Okay. UNODC is the custodian of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And we have a secretarial function which also includes acting as Secretariat to the implementation review mechanism of the Convention. Now the Convention is very broad-ranging and has criminalisation, prevention, international cooperation, asset recovery chapters. From the review mechanism, we basically identify technical assistance needs around the world and then effectively develop programs to meet those technical assistance needs. At the moment, we are working very closely to deepen our engagement in various regions of the world by creating first regional platforms where we bring countries together to actually identify common needs identified as a result of the implementation review mechanism of UNCAC, and also to bring experts from those countries to actually develop common solutions. Thereafter, we look to help countries actually implement those solutions, either by us providing support ourselves or by identifying others who could provide that support. At the moment as well, we've realised that the demand is great, so we're building a series of regional hubs of anti-corruption expertise around the world, where we place multiple experts in one location who can then both facilitate technical assistance and, where necessary, directly deliver that technical assistance. At the moment, some of the sort of more fresher areas that we are moving into and really increasing the volume of work on would include around the beneficial ownership agenda, around the use of technology in terms of strengthening anti-corruption initiatives, particularly in the procurement space. This really opened up as a result of the COVID pandemic. We're also looking at really strengthening domestic coordination in countries. We've got specific programs on bringing together supreme audit institutions and anti-corruption bodies. For instance, we're looking at coordination on two levels. We're looking at the sort of core anti-corruption service providers, the anti-corruption authorities, the prosecutors' officers, the auditor generals, etc. But then we're also looking at how we can expand anti-corruption work into specific sectors, because clearly a lot of the work that we would do on a cross-cutting nature anti-corruption will be applicable in sectors, and the people in those sectors need to know the tools that are available to them and use those tools.
You said that the work in the anti-corruption, you expand to the more specific. Can you tell us what is specific?
I mean, some of the specialist areas we would work on. I mean, yeah, I'm by background a forensic accountant. We provide support on financial investigations. We've tailored sort of into financial investigative training packages. We also provide mentoring on financial investigations. We also have extensive programs on looking at the gender programming within the anti-corruption space, whistleblower protection work, strengthening beneficial ownership transparency. We also, in terms of sectors, we have specific work looking at corruption in sport, corruption in the environmental sector, looking corruption in youth, working with the private sector. I mean, that's just a few of the specific programs we've got and a few of the specific areas we actually work on.
Okay, Tim. Your background as an accountant by training, how you see that the role of accountant in the corruption eradication?
I mean, one of the core things, I mean, an accountant as opposed to forensic accountant is, I'll sort of separate the two. I mean, the forensic accounting skills, which are very different to the skills that generally you would find within a law enforcement officer, are really quite central to most large-scale investigations. I mean, there's a tendency at the moment to extend financial investigation to have a very broad meaning. The forensic accounting work would be a lot more specialist, a lot more specific, really reconstructing financial records, that type of work, which helps you actually see the entire economic crime, the entire, how the criminal enterprise worked. So the forensic accountant can help significantly, particularly in large-scale cases. Now, more broadly, the accounting profession, you can split into there's a four-way split: public-private sector, and also internal-external accounting. But some of the skills, particularly your public sector accountants have, very good at identifying sort of risks, and that includes corruption risks. So looking maybe at extending into being able to help organisations identify the specific corruption risks, also that they face, either through an audit process sometimes, but more normally through a specific sort of risk assessment process. The skill sets are similar, so they can be used. Then if we look at the audit process, I mean, there's significant debate within the audit process as to whether auditors should identify corruption or not, but it's very likely that going through audits they will find transactions that need to be looked at more closely. Doesn't mean there's corruption there, but it means that perhaps investigators should look a lot more closely at those transactions. So there needs to be cooperation on that level where maybe the audit profession, the accounting profession, triggers the investigation at least. Sometimes they can go further, but really this sharing of information. There's also thinking about use of technology. I mean, accountants are increasingly using technologies that can also be applied in the anti-corruption space, and looking to expand those technologies into the anti-corruption space is another way that accountants can really help.
Okay, so the technology era, we need to develop the modern investigation, and what is the challenge to apply the modern investigation, especially maybe in public sector area?
As we get increasing amounts of online data in the public sector, that data, I mean, the very first trick is cleaning the data, because quite often the data that is captured is not really that usable at first, but that can be cleaned. You know, for instance, you know, how do you capture a date? You do month, day, year, year, day, month, and if you actually have, if you haven't got a protocol for that, you know, then people will capture it how they feel they want to capture it anyway around. So you have to move the data into a consistent format. Once you've got data cleaned, you can start drilling into that data, comparing different databases with each other, and you can start identifying transactions that look suspicious, individuals that potentially look suspicious. You know, for instance, you can, if you've got an electronic vehicle licensing register and you've got an electronic payroll, you can simply compare the two and say, okay, these people earned less than $1,000 a month and registered vehicles worth more than 100,000. It doesn't mean there's corruption or criminality, but it does mean it's worth a good look. But you can then develop that further with using artificial intelligence technologies, for instance, whereby you program in what is an illegal transaction or an illegal situation, and what is a legal transaction and a legal situation, and the system then learns itself to analyse a transaction and point out ones which are potentially legal, potentially illegal. I mean, this is quite old technology now, but it exists. Now, if you have the data and the data is clean, you can start using those technologies. You can start really identifying what is going on. And if we talk about the sort of whole openness around procurement processes, openness around beneficial ownership information, if you know who owns a business, the actual person, the actual people behind it, you can work out who you're dealing with. You can then look more closely at those people if you want, just online, and see what is going on, and give yourself some assurance that you're dealing with honest people who are going to deliver whatever it is you want them to deliver.
Okay, we know that data is everywhere now, but how to ensure that the data is clean? Can we make a tools, or maybe we can integrate it, data integrated as a one data, or how?
Look, I'm not I'll say up front, I'm not a tech specialist. You can see that the hair is going a bit grey, but so there's a whole generation of people who've got very clever solutions, but some very simple basics. When the information is captured, set up protocols for capturing the information. So, and set them up carefully. You can go back to the audit profession, audit what's captured and make sure it's being captured properly. These are sort of simple basics. But yes, cross-comparing information against data as well. You can then sort of throw up anomalies where you actually need to check and see, you know, this data on the person on the vehicle licensing doesn't register, is different to the data on the person on the housing deeds register, and then you need to check and clean. But you can gradually narrow down. But the very first thing is setting the protocols for how data is entered into the system, making the system sometimes relatively inflexible, or if you've got slightly more money, you can make the system more flexible, but it basically converts the data into a consistent format as someone captures it. The other trick is
Okay.
the other trick there, which is important, is not capturing too much.
Not capturing too much.
Yeah, you need to decide what it is you actually need to capture.
Okay.
You know, and that and define that closely so that it's not too much of a burden on the people who are actually having to report the data or enter the data.
And then, is there any initiative strategy to accelerate corruption eradication in the regional level, and then to maybe enhance the capacity of the accountant forensic?
In terms of our work, yeah, I mentioned the platforms and hubs. Now we are reactive to the demands of what countries are member states, but we have got a regional platform for Southeast Asia that was established in 2017. We've got and countries are receiving support either in the areas you say, some tailored forensic accounting training. But this is to me it seems to be quite a long-term process. You know, these are not skills that even everyone can learn, I don't think. You need to pick people with a specific interest and a specific aptitude, and it is a long-term process. You know, you can give the basics in a few weeks and you can mentor people, but you cannot, you know, to train as an accountant is several years. To train as an accountant is several years. To actually build good forensic accounting skills, if you can, because not all accountants can convert, is to probably another couple of years at least. Okay, so we don't at this stage have countries engaging with us to that level, because but what we are doing with quite a few countries around the world is we're creating some preconditions within their agencies, because the thing is, you can train someone, right, and a different trainer from a different country can give training based on what they know. But if the country that's being trained does not have operating procedures and systems within its agency, then what will happen is someone from country one will train on the system from country one, someone from country two will train on the system from country two. Perfectly good trainings, but they're different because the countries approach their investigations slightly differently. So one of the things we're doing is basically helping countries work through the operating procedures they need to do an investigation, make sure that the country has its own system that's consistent with its own laws, so that forms a strong basis for building capacity amongst the investigators and indeed the prosecutors there.
Okay, and how about the public participation? How important it is in fighting corruption?
There's basically building public with integrity, because if people believe corruption is okay, or gaining money by corrupt acts is clever or whatever, if that's the prevailing belief, then it's going to be very hard to actually address corruption. If the prevailing belief is that you should behave in a more honest way, then you're in a much better position to address corruption. And that's really working with society, working with organisations as well, but starting really with curricula at school, working through building in society. That's one aspect, is that building the belief, the support for integrity across the whole of society, really. The second thing I'd like to highlight is the best eyes and ears for corruption investigators, prosecutors, people looking to do corruption prevention work is the general public. It may be channeled through civil society organisations. It may be direct. But if people know what they should be receiving, what they should be expecting, so transparency, say in procurement processes, transparency in what state should be delivering, and people are trained and the public participate, then there's going to be an outcry if people don't get what they know they should get, or if they see procurement processes, rights allocation processes, if they see those being unfair. If they know what's happening, and then the public becomes a bit of a watchdog, and it makes it a lot more difficult for individuals or organisations to actually break the rules. So, in terms of participation, making sure that the public understand why integrity is so important, support integrity, and empowering the public to act as watchdogs. I mentioned the sort of gender work, but maybe I should actually talk about inclusion, because the other thing is that if state processes are inclusive of as many elements of society as possible, that sort of spreads, one, where people are recruited to, but two also who receives state contracts, state quotas, state licenses. And the more you spread that, the better a chance you are of not getting a particular group capturing it for their own benefit, and getting sort of fair and honest dealing.
Okay. The interesting thing is that you highlight in terms of participation, make sure that the public has an integrity.
Yeah, make sure they understand, because it's frightening. I've seen surveys in some parts of the world where half the youth believe that how you get money doesn't matter as long as you get it.
Okay. Next, what would be opportunities and challenges for having effective collective action against corruption?
Opportunity, that's a long one. Okay. And in terms of collective action agenda, there's a big challenge in building a common understanding around what the actual underlying problem is. And if you look globally, there's been a gradual sort of development of how people look at the anti-corruption agenda. Sort of 20 years ago, 25 years ago, setting up anti-corruption commissions was what people were doing. You set up the anti-corruption commission and you'd pretty much dealt with corruption. Then people started saying these anti-corruption commissions are set up to fail, etc. They can't do everything, whatever. Now, as we've moved forward, we've realised that across government there needs to be a lot of different tools to actually address corruption. So we've started building the tools. But then the next thing is, if we were to take it to a sector level, okay, let's say the health or education sector, what is actually driving corruption? Now, the first problem comes, you could go to one school and you could find that one thing is driving corruption. For instance, you could go to one school and find that where they kept the exam papers was not secure. for instance, and what was driving corruption was in fact the admin staff were deliberately leaving things unsecure because they were getting paid off to let people have access. You could go to another place where you find that the problem is quite different. The problem is that people are complaining they have to pay, say, the head teacher for admission to the school. And both of those may go back to integrity, but integrity of different groups of people. So when you're designing a collective action, you have to try and think about what is the problem, what is the issue you're trying to address, and you have to think about different levels of issue, because I mean very clearly, I mean the simple example I just gave, school, where two problems could be completely different. You know, if you set up something to build sort of integrity amongst head teachers because of charging people for admission to school, and the problem is actually someone leaving easy access to exam papers, for instance, the head teacher's got nothing against it, would actually sack the person for doing that. Your action won't fix it. So the biggest challenge is actually defining what it is to take collective action against, because every corruption scheme is specific. I mean, sure, collective action on a broad integrity agenda is fine, but you're still looking to stop that small percentage of the population who will behave badly no matter what the values are, what the rules are, how strong the systems are. Now, the opportunity, I mean, technology gives us opportunities to move information more quickly, to analyse information more quickly, to understand what is happening more quickly. The other opportunity is that when I talk about these specific schemes, people know about them. You know, it's not it doesn't really require particularly specialist people to actually go and identify the schemes. If you talk to people working in an organisation, they know where the risks they face are. They know what people have complained about. You know, these aren't secrets. The trick there is simply getting people to talk and looking through collective action towards the future to actually build solutions. So rather than witch hunting people, look at building solutions that close the loopholes, work on the overall integrity of people within the organisation, people who interact with the organisation. Because I promise it, when you close down one scheme, those who want to be delinquent, those who want to be corrupt, will simply find and create another scheme. So getting people to identify, getting people to understand, then second thing, using technology to also help identify, so you can actually find the issues on which to build the collective action platforms more carefully, and there is a very big opportunity there, and I think there is a willingness of a lot of societies to engage.
Okay, using the technology to make reducing anti-corruption, and then with each corruption has a specific scheme, and then after the pandemic and the global recession had, how UNODC anticipate the economic new crime modus? You said that about specific scheme.
I mean, through the pandemic, we've seen across the world, we've seen people setting up all sorts of schemes to take advantage of it. We've seen students charging governments for applying COVID tests. when they don't even have an office. We've seen claims for subsidy money, etc. But, I mean, with all these schemes that have come up, because there's a lot of money that has gone in, I mean, one thing, anyone who wants to sort of read about how countries around the world have given UNODC a mandate, if they look at something called the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration, which was Resolution 9-1 at the last Conference of State Parties held in Sharm el-Sheikh, that is mandating us to take a broad range of actions to address corruption in emergencies, and for countries to take a broad range of actions to address corruption in emergencies. I must say, though, the COVID pandemic, I think, perversely has actually moved the anti-corruption agenda forward. And we're seeing, particularly in the procurement space, quite significant advances being made in quite a few countries. Because I think when they sort of the various faster emergency procurements were necessary during the pandemic, countries became very aware of how vulnerable and how fragile their procurement systems were.
So the more the investigation, we need to know and then how to anticipate it, the new crime modus.
Criminals are very inventive, I've got to say, so we'll never anticipate everything. But on the corruption preventive side, we actually talk to organisations, we talk to managers within organisations on quite an open basis. They will very often know where their vulnerabilities are. They will very often know where people have either tried to commit corrupt acts in the past, or where they don't actually have control fully over what's happening within their organisation. They'll also know, interestingly, when, say, change is coming. You know, if you have significant change, you create opportunities. I mean, obviously we can't predict emergencies, because emergencies by their nature are unpredictable, but we can predict some change. I mean, for instance, if we were to look at the move to, say, renewable energies, governments have got very long-term plans to secure enough power, enough energy. And if we look at move to renewables, there's a top-level decision, but that runs down into hundreds of thousands of individual actions on the ground, and it's very easy, as the change is happening, for someone to see an opportunity to take an advantage of that change situation to actually commit a corrupt act. And there will also, in that change, there will be people who maybe see themselves as losers, and they will be more incentivized to actually commit a corrupt act. So on that basis, we can start predicting. So, I mean, the most basic thing is just talk to the managers within an organisation, see where they feel vulnerable, they think they're vulnerable. Next thing is look at when we're introducing changes. Look at particularly change, and then also anything where there's a lot of money, because people generally are corrupt because they want to benefit themselves. So if there's a lot of benefit available, then there's a lot of then people will put a lot of effort into looking to see how they can actually to obtain that benefit. So we can predict. I'm personally very sceptical of red flag systems, because red flag systems tend to become so broad that you're looking at, you can make almost anything a red flag. This person spent too much, they've spent too little, they didn't go on holiday, they did go on holiday. It becomes a very difficult thing to define. But if you keep to some fairly simple principles, you can start to really understand where vulnerabilities exist, and vulnerabilities will look different from organisation to organisation.
And then what should be done to measure the implementation on foreign bribery mandatory provision under UNODC in Indonesia? Could you please elaborate that for us?
I've got to say up front, I'm not an Indonesia-specific expert, but in terms of the foreign bribery provision, in UNCAC, for those who are legal technical, it's Article 16, and the mandatory provision makes both the active bribery and the passive bribery, so the offering and the receiving are both offences, are both seen as things that should be criminalised. Now, for most countries in the world, enforcement is a problem, and there is a two-level problem. There's one, a resourcing problem. Generally, foreign bribery cases may be large and complex. Okay, that means that the investigators and the prosecutors need to be resourced, and they also need to be protected, because if you've got a large complex corruption scheme, you've got people who may be powerful, people who've got a lot of money involved, and they will go a long way to fight it. I mean, typically wealthy, powerful people can employ large law firms, expensive law firms, and the prosecutor might come up against 10, 15, 20 lawyers working for the team on the other side. And if the prosecutor isn't adequately resourced, isn't strongly enough resourced, then that's a problem. And so pretty much almost every country in the world, I would firstly say, more resources for the investigators, prosecutors who are working these cases. But the second problem comes, and this is not purely an Indonesian problem, it's a problem again everywhere. In fact, this week some of my colleagues are at a meeting of what we call the Globe Network, which is on international cooperation, which is looking at anti-corruption law enforcement, strengthening international cooperation informally. Now, the issue is that you need to get information very often from another country. I may be the person who's tasked with coordination country to country. I want to coordinate, but I have to get law enforcement officers, investigators, prosecutors to actually do some work. Now, it's getting the people in the other country to actually prioritise the work that you want them to do, because it may not be their priority. You know, you think you're the chief of police for a district and you've got 15 unsolved murders you want your officers looking at. Why are they going to go and get information for another country on a bribery case which involves people who are seen as contributors, upstanding citizens within the area that chief of police is responsible for? So it's basically taking advantage of informal and formal contacts for international cooperation, building relationships with the countries, law enforcement in the countries where you're going to be seeking information. Because if those relationships are not strong and not good, it's going to be very difficult to actually get the information on time and to actually do it. So, I mean, there's multiple other challenges, I've got to say, and the other thing I would say is these large complex cases tend to come down to the actual dedication of individual investigators or prosecutors as to whether they succeed or fail. Better approach, prevent them in the first place.
Okay. Law enforcement law enforcement is a problem. Always a problem.
It's difficult. Enforcement is difficult, and it is. And I say I mean, you can train people, you can do everything right, and the case can still fail. In court. It can, I mean, part of the work of a good investigative and good prosecutorial unit is every time the case either succeeds or fails, is doing a post-mortem on that actual case to understand what went well, what went badly, getting better. I mean, but around the world, it is a major challenge, and generally, prosecutors in particular, investigators also under-resourced, and generally courts, and rightly so, will have some sort of presumption of innocence and will allow some sort of latitude to suspects. But that also needs to be managed. You know, if you find out that the suspect is not actually ever good, the hearings are never happening because the suspect is always sick, and that the proof, and that you know that the suspect who was very sick in the morning they were meant to be in court was out enjoying dinner that evening, you know, and that happens many times. You know, you need to put in systems to sort of make sure that the investigators and prosecutors basically stand a chance of actually getting the case heard. I'm not referring to Indonesia specifically here, because I really am not expert in Indonesia.
Okay, Tim. Regarding to environmental issues, I read in the UNODC webpage that now raise up environmental crime. What is the nexus of environmental crime to the corruption?
Well,
maybe in the short answer.
In short, the short answer is that corruption can undermine any action that we take to address environmental crime. And the other second issue is that environmental crime is very, very often economic crime. It's very often for money. And particularly if we look at the forests, the fisheries, there is huge money involved. Okay, and so that leads to corruption at multiple different levels. I mean, at the highest level in some places, it's difficult to prove, it's difficult to see, but I mean, when regulation on, say, who might qualify for a license or a quota is introduced, the law might be influenced by bribery. It might be that legislators are influenced by bribery at that level. Then at the next level, you have a lot, and there's a lot of cases, including some I've seen there in Indonesia, where people have engaged in corrupt practices to determine who gets licenses, permits for what, and potentially also maybe to, in the case of forests, sell off state land which wasn't meant to be sold for use for other purposes. So you've got that middle level where these would be relatively senior officials giving license permits. Then you've got corruption at the lowest level, where the person is just taking a small bribe to not notice that an animal has been poached, or a tree has been cut down, or that the fishing boats come in with the wrong type of fish. So all of these linkages. I mean, clearly the first one I mentioned is the most damaging. If the rules of the game have actually been, the rules of how the license, the quota even the policy on whether you actually utilize resources or conserve resources, if that is influenced by corruption, everything else might appear legal further down, but the whole thing is tainted. That leads back to public participation. The public need to watch what's happening on legislation and how it's working. They need to be a watchdog.
Okay, Tim, you have shared to us about your perspective and then opinion about all of the forensic and then investigative strategy, and then about how the public participation as a watchdog in reducing anti-corruption. Maybe you want to share something that for the last.
Some last comments, something general.
Last comments.
I think that for the future, the hope is that we have more information both on how systems and structures work. We have more access to information. We engage society more broadly, both as watchdogs and participants in government processes. I believe the opening up of information, the use of information, the use of technology together with citizen engagement can actually close the space for corruption. But countries have to be aware of the legislation that they will need to pass to make these things happen. And they do have to be aware that it's not something that's going to happen quickly and simply. It's something that will require a lot of work. But I do think that as we stand in 2022, there is an opportunity going forward.
Okay, thank you, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Vita. Okay. I hope I gave you what you needed.
Hal yang paling penting dalam membangun partisipasi publik dalam upaya melawan korupsi, memerangi korupsi adalah memastikan bahwa publik memiliki integritas. Tanpa integritas, maka partisipasi publik tidak akan efektif untuk menurunkan angka korupsi. Salam integritas.